Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and get comfortable, dim the lights, and let the room get quiet. Tonight we're not talking about battles, or shiny portraits, or dramatic coronations. No. Tonight we're gently wandering into a world that smelled a lot less glamorous than you probably imagine. We're talking about Tudor bathrooms. Yes. A whole dynasty, without plumbing. Now, when you think of the Tudors, you probably picture Henry VIII strutting around in wide shoulders and velvet, or Elizabeth I smirking behind a starched lace ruff. Maybe you picture the glitter of jewels, or some grand banquet table groaning under whole roasted peacocks. But the truth of daily life was not nearly that sparkling. The truth involved chamber pots, laundry that never quite came clean, body odor disguised with cloves in sleeves, and an atmosphere in London's air that can best be described as dense. And that's me putting it politely. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let's just step slowly into that world. Calmly, without judgment. Imagine yourself walking through a Tudor palace, down a hallway lined with tapestries. The portraits stare back at you. The wooden floorboards creak beneath your feet. But the air is already carrying a little more reality than those paintings reveal. Because for Henry VIII, the royal bathroom, or as they called it, the privy chamber, was not porcelain, not helping more than that. Now you're probably imagining some unlucky servant delegate, and not private. It was a padded chair. A wooden box disguised as furniture, called a close stool. Really just a fancy chair with a pan underneath. Henry owned a few of them. Some covered in velvet, because of course he was. But at the end of the day, it was still a box doing what a box does. And here's the twist, he didn't even handle this process alone. He had a personal attendant, an official with one of the most unfortunate job titles in history. He had a groom of the stool. And yes, the stool means exactly what you think it means. The groom's duty was to be there, ready, whenever the king needed to use his close stool. Supplying water, cloth, linen. Sometimes, owing this while wishing for another life. But actually, this was considered a high honor. Because being the man closest to the king physically meant you were also closest to the king politically. The groom of the stool had constant access. And in a court where access equaled power, yes, the bathroom attendant often became one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. Networking while handing Henry a towel. Political influence delivered in the privy. Only in Tudor England. Now if you weren't royal, life was simpler. You had a chamber pot. One in every room where sleep happened. Ceramic, pewter, maybe iron, maybe even silver if you were absurdly rich. You kept it by the bed for the night, and emptied it in the morning. And where did it go? Straight into the cesspits or the river, if you were lucky. Or right out the window if you weren't. Which meant, yes, Londoners walking down narrow medieval streets lived under a permanent threat of surprise showers. Technically, etiquette required you shout, garde-le, a mumbled French warning meaning, watch for the water. But plenty of people didn't bother. If you've ever felt unlucky with bird droppings, imagine that on the scale of an entire bucket. Cesspits themselves filled up astonishingly fast. They had to be cleared. Which gave us another memorable job title, the gong farmer. Gong being slang for literal human waste. Gong farmers went out at night, climbing down into pits with shovels and buckets, knee-deep in the reality of urban life. They hauled it out, carted it away, and dumped it beyond the city walls. If you're imagining the least glamorous night shift in history, you are correct. They were paid well enough, partly in hazard wages, partly because no one else wanted to come within 10 yards of them. The smell clung. Gong farmers had money but no friends. That was the urban experience. Now, if we float back inside the palaces, what we find isn't much better, just decorated differently. Hampton Court during Henry's day housed up to 600 people between courtiers, servants, cooks, musicians, guards, and whoever else drifted through on occasion. That meant 600 bodies digesting 600 meals a day. It meant chamber pots stacked in every corner. It meant open walkways not just for nobles, but for animals, with horses stabled nearby. Visitors from abroad wrote polite but noticeable remarks about how the finest palaces smelled more like livestock barns. And when banquet season came, the ratio of food entering to waste leaving tipped aggressively in the wrong direction. To disguise the smell of palaces, they covered the floors with rushes, herbs, and flowers. Don't imagine delicate bouquets. Imagine stalks of straw, mixed with lavender, or mint, or whatever they had on hand. Fresh layers trampled underfoot every so often, absorbing beer spills, grease droppings, chamber pot overflows. Walk across the rushes and you'd smell rosemary wafting upward. But underneath? Layers of yesterday, layers of last week, pressed down into the wood. Think about a compost heap pretending to be air freshener. That was a Tudor floor. Now we pivot to bathing. And this is where modern expectations really collapse. You might think, surely they at least cleaned up after all that. But bathing was rare. Suspicious, even. Doctors of the time warned that hot baths opened your pores to disease. The cleaner you thought you got, the sicker you might become. So Tudors invented a loophole. Instead of bathing your skin, you changed your underwear. Fine linen shifts and shirts worn next to the skin were believed to pull away dirt and sweat like magic filters. So rich courtiers piled up drawers of linens, changing them daily, sending them to laundresses who boiled them, beat them with wooden paddles, and hung them to dry. Fresh linen equaled health. A clean shirt meant a clean soul. Meanwhile, the body underneath was scrubbed little, if at all. Even Elizabeth, fastidious by comparison, bathed once a month. Whether she needed it or not, as one ambassador noted. That was brag-worthy hygiene. The average peasant washed as they could, in rivers or tubs, with rough soap that stung the skin. Few had more than 1 or 2 shirts total. So while noblemen puffed about in layers of crisp linen, peasants wore the same sweat-damp fabric until laundry day, which wasn't soon. And yet, these were societies obsessed with scent. Little pomanders, tiny metal balls on chains, carried herbs like clove, nutmeg, or rosemary inside, swinging from belts or necks. Wealthy men tucked slices of fruit into their coats. Women perfumed their gloves. If you're seeing a theme here, it's true. Half of Tudor medicine, Tudor cleanliness, Tudor fashion, was fighting smell with stronger smell. But scent wasn't just perfume. Hair was another battlefield. Lice were a universal experience. Nitpicking was literal. Families sat together, combs clicking, hunting through wigs or braids by candlelight. If you were wealthy, you shaved your head and wore a wig. Wigs could at least be cleaned with powders, while real hair required more elbow grease. If you were poor, you did your best with oils, home combs, or you just endured the itching. Another ordinary noise in Tudor court was wigs being scratched, adjusted, deloused. Teeth were no better. There were no toothbrushes in Tudor England. They rubbed teeth with cloth, maybe used salt, ash, or herbs. And sugar, newly fashionable from foreign colonies, wreaked havoc. Queen Elizabeth loved candied fruits so much that she ended with blackened, painful teeth. And because trends are strange, people admired it. Black teeth meant wealth. In fact, some poor courtiers darkened their own teeth to mimic it. If you couldn't afford sugar, at least you could stain your smile. The irony, of course, is that peasants with rough, gritty bread didn't get sugar rot, they just ground their teeth down to stubs. Dentistry wasn't winning anywhere. So imagine it. A palace great hall. Torches glowing. Courtiers brushing shoulders in silks. Everyone perfumed to survive the scent. Underneath, linen shirts catching sweat, wigs disguising lice, mouths dark from sugar or grain. Dogs wandering, chamber pots tucked discreetly behind curtains. And an architectural corner for the groom of the stool, waiting, influential, ready. It was all gross. But it was also, comfortingly, just human. Everyday reality never bowed to portrait painters. Behind the jeweled ruffs and velvet came the same smells, aches, and trips to the bathroom. The Tudors weren't marble gods. They were damp, itchy, and perfumed. Pretending. Much as we all are sometimes. And that's the soft truth about Tudor bathrooms. A dynasty remembered in oil paint as glorious, but lived day to day in rushes that crunched underfoot, chamber pots that sloshed under beds, and summer streets that steamed more than they should have. So as you drift tonight, just breathe calmly. Remember your clean sheets. Your hot shower waiting for you tomorrow. And your porcelain throne. Because however majestic Tudor power looked, you, with your toothbrush and plumbing, are already living better than Henry VIII ever did. So now that we've floated through the everyday bathroom routines, let's quietly settle in closer to the Tudors themselves. Because if the ordinary people smelled bad, and the palaces smelled bad, imagine how the kings and queens, wrapped in layers of velvet and lace, decorated with jewels but trapped in their own biology, managed to cope. And by cope, I really mean, distract everyone else with perfume while quietly rotting underneath. We'll start with the obvious. Henry VIII. You've seen the portraits, broad chest, swollen face, eyes daring you to comment on his turkey leg diet. What the portraits don't breathe across the canvas is the stench. By his later years, Henry wasn't just large, he was essentially a walking medical file. Constant ulcers on his legs oozed through bandages. The infections wouldn't heal, partly because he believed in cures like more food, more wine, less movement. He wrapped his calves in cloth, and the palace smelled accordingly. Foreign ambassadors noted it politely, as one does when sitting near a monarch while quietly gagging. The king's bedchambers were filled with concoctions, bandages, potions, and attendants tasked with rewrapping wounds. Imagine working in his privy chamber, already stuck with his toilet break schedule, and now layered with the bonus aroma of open sores. There was no perfume strong enough. Henry still had his grooms of the stool, still had people hovering intimately near him. Because this man, despite smelling like a battlefield infirmary and sounding like one too when he groaned, was still the sun they orbited. You had to flatter him, reassure him, support him. And maybe, just maybe, avoid breathing too deeply. Meanwhile, his daughter Elizabeth preferred a different approach. Where her father drowned in food and stench, she drowned in scent and cloth. Elizabeth I was obsessed with appearances. She painted her face with lead-based white paste until her skin cried out. She layered herself in velvet, lace, pearls. Her solution to hygiene was powder, perfume, and pretending. She was said to own dozens of pairs of perfumed gloves, each soaked with oils of orange or rose or jasmine. So whenever she held court, every wave of her hand came with its own cloud. Like a human air freshener drifting through the great hall. Did it work? Not exactly. Elizabeth bathed, as we said, once a month. And by bathed, that usually meant warm water poured into a wooden tub, perfume scattered afterward. So the layers of scent weren't covering cleanliness. They were covering the lack of it. But in her court, this was glamorous. You didn't question the queen. If she wanted to smell like roses and lead paint baked together, you told her she was radiant. Her teeth were another story. By later years, Elizabeth loved sugar so much that her teeth blackened. They caused her pain, made it difficult to eat, and widened the distance from youthful portraits. But instead of making sugar unfashionable, it almost made rotted teeth trendy. Courtiers darkened their own smiles to match, pretending their decay was wealth. Yes, that's right. Imagine deliberately coloring your teeth black just to look like you could afford candied orange peels. Another Tudor paradox. Status marked in the strangest ways. Mary Tudor, Elizabeth's half-sister, didn't help her reputation by smelling better. In fact, Mary's contemporaries noted her fondness for heavy gloves soaked in musk. Which, if you don't know musk, isn't fresh and floral. It's earthy, almost animal. Covering sweat with musk gloves in already odor-heavy court halls might not have helped so much as blended her right into the stew of smells. Still, gloves were safer than going without cover. Because ladies of the Tudor dynasty lived in corsetry and skirts so wide it was practically an architectural feat to use a chamber pot gracefully. Sometimes, they arranged pots under skirts without entirely disrobing, which meant privacy was relative, and servants were often nearby anyway. Hygiene was always mediated, never private. And the reminder in all of this is simple: even as they ruled, they lived in a world where sighing and sneezing in public was considered part of etiquette. Privacy simply did not exist. Now if we float away from the monarchs, but still hover high in nobility, the habits don't improve. Courtiers shared rooms, often slept a few in a bed. Bedding meant to impress a visitor could easily be crawling with lice, hidden under glittering hangings. Servants were everywhere, hauling water, hauling waste, changing linens, trying not to comment while standing near royalty overtaken by digestive inspiration. The palaces were full of sound, not just music, conversation, and feasts, but coughing, belching, the shuffle of people pouring ale, and chamber pots clanging as they were carried away. This was the true chorus of Tudor life. People still marveled at these monarchs. They were majestic. They were distant. But they were also itchy, sometimes rotting, and always perfumed to hide it. The modern-day dream of Tudor glamour, of swans roasted on silver platters, misses the detail that swans were followed closely by gong farmers carting bucket-loads of waste out the back stairs every night. The bigger the feast, the fuller the pits beneath. And with no plumbing and few rules about separation, your fragrance of roasted venison was almost always layered with a contrasting note of night soil drifting faintly from somewhere nearby. Elizabeth particularly clung to gloves, perfumes, and starch to hold her image together. Her starched lace ruffs kept skin hidden, but also kept her separate, a kind of shielded portrait in fabric. She turned herself into a painting come to life. And paintings don't reveal smell. They don't show toothaches or wig itch. They don't mention that the Queen's bathing schedule was more ceremonial than sanitary. But the courtiers around her knew. They weren't fooled. They just politely pretended. So, the Tudor bathroom reality was always just beneath the show. Henry limped around with suppurating legs, still stuffing himself with roasted meats, and still surrounded by attendants who called him mighty. Elizabeth covered her skin with lead paint that poisoned her slowly, perfumed herself with orange-scented gloves, and smiled through decaying teeth. Palaces echoed with glory hand in hand with foul air. Visitors coughed into handkerchiefs, and chronicles were written without ever mentioning what must have been overwhelming for the nose. And that's maybe the most relaxing way to picture them. The Tudors, serious in oil paint, commanding in history textbooks, quietly rotting, or perfumed, or chamber pot dependent. Human in the most uncomfortable ways. They ruled over diplomacy, religion, rebellion, but they never escaped their own bodies. The groom of the stool, carrying influence as well as cloth. The laundresses, boiling sheets that stood in for soap. The gong farmers, bailing out civilization one bucket at a time. These are the people who truly sustained the dynasty. You don't see them on the tapestry, but they were the foundation underneath. So as you close your eyes, imagine Henry brooding in velvet with bandages seeping beneath, or Elizabeth powdered and perfumed in orange blossom, black teeth hidden by polite smiles, courtiers bowing deeply all the while. History looks gilded from afar. But up close, it was always earthy. Always human. And always, without fail, gross. So now let's drift out of the gilded palaces and back down to earth. To the ordinary Tudors, the shopkeepers, the ale sellers, the cobblers, the laborers. The people whose bathroom experience was even less glamorous than Henry's padded close stool. Let's imagine walking through a narrow London street, sometime in the middle of the 16th century, when the air was thick and the ground was usually wet. Because in Tudor England, the streets themselves told you everything you needed to know about public hygiene. First, the streets weren't paved. Not in the way you'd like them to be. They were mud in wet weather, dust and dry, scattered with straw and filth. Every horse added to it. Every dog. And every upstairs neighbor who leaned out the window and hurled down a chamber pot. The gutters down the center of roads sluggishly carried rain and waste together. In hot weather, you couldn't escape the smell. In cold weather, it just froze into place. And nobody thought twice. For them, this was the city. Normal. A bit ripe, but expected. Water wasn't exactly trustworthy either. The Thames was everybody's river. Drinking water was carried from it. But it was also the laundry stream, the latrine, the dump site for butchers, and yes, the exhaust pipe for hundreds of chamber pots. People did what they could to filter or boil water, but for the most part you drank weak beer. Ale was safer than water. So Tudors drank beer for practically everything: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Even children had small beer, very light, just enough alcohol to keep bacteria at bay. Imagine an entire society tipsy at all hours, not because they wanted it, but because that was just survival. Laundry was the stand-in for soap and showers. Linens pulled dirty oils from the body, but then laundresses had to haul those linens to washing places. The process was brutal: water heated in great tubs, lye soap that stung the skin, sheets beaten against wooden frames or stones until they gave up at least some of their grime. Laundresses were backbone workers, boiling their arms pink in steam, carrying baskets heavier than they looked. And yet the result was still fairly rough cloth, stiff in texture, faint with smoke or soap. No lavender freshness, no conditioners, no fluff. Just stiff shirts, dried by the air, whiter than before but rarely clean. Inside homes, people relied on scents to freshen the air. A sprig of rosemary pinned to a cap. Herbs on the floor, crushed underfoot. The richer homes might dangle small bags of cloves or dried flowers in corners. But the smell of a fire, the tang of animals, the stubborn odor of humanity, it all lingered in the walls. Every Tudor home had a baseline smell. Each house was its own permanent blend of wood smoke, sweat, dried ale, damp wool, and cooking stew. Step inside and you'd immediately know where you were. Family scents, baked in. Public bathhouses, which once existed in medieval towns, were falling out of fashion. Too much suspicion about immorality, people sharing baths and conversations. And too much fear of plague, since doctors warned bathhouses spread disease. By the Tudor age, most of them were gone. If you were rural, you might wash in a river or tub when you could. If you were wealthier, you might soak in a wooden bathtub hauled into your chamber, heated with buckets of boiling water. But few saw this as regular. It was occasional. It was luxurious. Cleaning your whole body too often was thought excessive, even dangerous. The stink of the population was normalized. And if all of this sounds appalling, remember they didn't think so. They didn't expect porcelain, toothbrushes, bottled water. Smell wasn't a problem. It was just part of the texture of life. A city was supposed to smell. Work was supposed to smell. People worked, sweated, and ate onions, and nobody asked why you didn't smell like cucumbers. You only worried about smell if you couldn't mask it when standing before nobility. Then you dabbed some rosemary juice, you burned incense, you soaked your gloves. But otherwise, you lived inside the odor cloud the same way fish live in water. You just didn't notice it was everywhere. Imagine a summer evening in Tudor London. Sun setting, smoke from fires drifting through narrow alleys. Children throwing stones in the yards, pigs trotting nearby. Women emptying chamber pots with or without warning. Men stumbling out of alehouses. And underneath, the constant hum of life, coughing, belching, spitting, clanging pewter mugs, footsteps on muddy floors. No one is clean. No one is fresh. But everyone is used to it. The only people who sometimes smelled sharper were the barber surgeons, those odd hybrids of haircutting and medical work. They handled bloodletting, teeth pulling, and haircutting all in one day. Their shops smelled salty, metallic. They oiled their scissors, rubbed poultices on customers. And the floor was just a scatter of hair and sawdust, with a little blood mixed in. Another approach at public hygiene, Tudor style. In towns, there were also laws occasionally passed about when you could empty your refuse and when you couldn't. But enforcement was lax. A proclamation might say, "No throwing filth into the Thames," and the very next day, a butcher dumped his offal. The city survived on shrugs. Things piled up until someone cleaned. Disease spread until someone quarantined. But it was never preventative. Always circular. So in this roundabout way, hygiene for common people was nothing like ours. It was pragmatic. It was irregular. It was brewing beer instead of boiling water, soaking hands in cold rivers instead of daily soap, scattering herbs underneath chairs, pinning cloves to hats, lighting candles for more than decoration. They scrubbed their linens fiercely because that was the shield. They accepted their neighborhood river as both bathtub and sewer. And they lived inside a nest of scents we would gag at, but they barely noticed. And if you think about it from a sleepy distance, maybe it was comforting. Uniform. Everyone smelled. Everyone had lice. Everyone relied on the same weak ale and the same laundress shouting about water. Nobody was special in sweat. Life was just one long balancing act of pretending you were fragrant with flowers while the street outside your window was being scrubbed clear by a gong farmer in the middle of the night. And as you imagine yourself in that world, with herbs underfoot, linen scratching against your skin, ale warm in a mug, the street rumbling faintly below, it all becomes oddly soothing. Humble. Not glamorous. Just the calm monotony of human beings who endured it, who normalized it, and who barely cared. Gross, yes. But shared. Tudor hygiene wasn't individual. It was communal. Everyone participated in the odor orchestra. And that, in its own sleepy way, made it bearable. So, now that we've stepped through the muddy streets and the ale-soaked common routines, let's drift back into the palaces again to talk about the very rare luxury moments, the baths. Because believe it or not, even though most Tudors side-eyed water like it was a suspicious relative borrowing money, there were still occasions where they climbed, awkwardly, into a wooden tub. Royal baths were practically ceremonial. A wooden tub would be dragged into a chamber, usually the bedchamber of whoever mattered the most. Servants lugged heavy buckets of hot water one after another, pouring them in until the tub was half filled. Imagine the labor before you even dipped a toe in. The water was scented with herbs, rosemary, thyme, rose petals, marjoram, not because it actually cleaned much, but because being surrounded by floating petals made it feel fancy. Sometimes oils were added, like almond oil, so the skin could soak in something resembling luxury. Elizabeth I supposedly loved orange-scented oils. She sat surrounded by perfumed steam, as if herbs in drifting water made up for the fact that the wooden tub was basically a giant barrel, and the servants standing nearby were watching. Because remember, privacy wasn't the goal. These baths were done with attendants handling the pores, the sheets around the tub, the towels afterward. Queens didn't really wash alone. Which meant the act of bathing wasn't refreshing as much as awkward. For Henry VIII, bathing slipped off the schedule as he aged. Rolling an overweight king with pus-oozing ulcers into a bathtub wasn't exactly easy. By then, Wiping with cloths soaked in vinegar or rose water replaced most of anything resembling a bath. He preferred scented linens changed regularly, oils rubbed into his skin by attendants, perfumes in cloth satchels stuffed under his armpits. The man could afford cinnamon imported from foreign markets, so why not treat his bathroom routine like he was marinating in spice? But when people couldn't afford woods or tubs or piles of petals, they turned to smaller rituals. One was rinsing the face each morning. Even peasants splashed cold water on their eyes at least, partly for refreshment, partly for waking up. Another was hand-washing before meals, not soap lather the way we'd know it, but pouring water from a jug over hands. Nobles had servants hold basins. Peasants did it in buckets. And this ritual created the illusion of hygiene through repetition. Remedies for smell and sweat verged on strange. Vinegar was popular, splashed liberally onto cloths to wipe the body. Vinegar was thought to kill illness and drive off contagion. Perfumes were believed to protect you from plague. Doctors actually prescribed inhaling certain scents to strengthen the brain. So when you stuffed a pomander ball with clove, nutmeg, or ambergris, you weren't just masking your neighbor's ill breath, you were practicing medicine. Or at least, Tudor medicine. For teeth, powders were the rage. Salt rubbed into gums, or crushed oyster shells mixed with herbs. Soot, sometimes. Bread ashes. Whatever rough texture you could get to scrape enamel. Did it work? Barely. It probably scratched up teeth worse. But it felt like effort, and effort meant cleanliness. And after, you might chew on parsley or mint to refresh the mouth. Parsley was famously fashionable. Imagine entire courts with parsley breath, their blackened teeth unfortunate, but their post-supper herb sprig clutched between jaws in a solemn attempt to seem fresh. Hair was tamed with combs and oils. Rose oil, lavender oil, rosemary rubbed into the scalp. Not because this stopped lice, but because it soothed itches and smelled better when people leaned close. A woman's head reeked of herbs when you kissed her cheek. A man's wig powdered with starch wafted the smell of clove as soon as he tipped it off. The Tudors weren't clean, but they worked endlessly at maintaining an aura. They didn't want to be fresh. They wanted to be thought fresh. Clothing served the same role. Fresh linens were the real bathing. Slip into a crisp white shift, scented faintly with soap or lavender water, and suddenly you felt clean. Even if your actual skin hadn't been properly washed in weeks. Nobles stacked chest after chest with fresh fabric. Peasants tugged into stained shirts and hoped their neighbor stank worse. Cleanliness was always relative. And still, there was ritual and comfort in these half-measures. Bathhouses gone. Showers, centuries away. But Tudors carved routines: wash your hands and face, chew parsley, pour vinegar water across your wrists, change your shirt. On feast days, maybe climb into a perfumed wooden barrel. On special occasions, rub your cheeks pink with cloth until the dirt blurred softly into a flush. And afterward, cloak yourself in velvet, perfume, and starch, convinced that smell equaled health. Doctors agreed. The theory was simple: nice smells purified the air before you breathed it. Bad smells made you sick. The Tudor age was obsessed with balancing humors in the body: hot, cold, dry, moist, so scents were considered another balancing agent. Your gloves soaked in rose oil weren't fashion, they were protection. Your chamber filled with sweet herbs wasn't decoration, it was medicine. Of course, it didn't work. Plagues swept through the palaces the same as the streets. Sweating sickness, smallpox, typhus. You can perfume a glove to high heaven, but when your entire city throws chamber pots into the same river it drinks from, the math always catches up. But it's almost sweet, in a human way. The Tudors clung to their rituals. They needed to feel safe. So if rosemary pinned to your doublet made you think you were protected, then you wore it. If vinegar wiped across your face each morning kept away disease, then you did it. Few things unite humanity across centuries like our inventiveness in pretending we're less smelly than we are. And so, Tudor hygiene floated somewhere between medicine and magic, sanitation and superstition. It was all about feeling balanced, feeling clean. You weren't any cleaner. But you believed you were. And that belief kept you steady as the Thames carried waste downstream, as chamber pots slammed shut beneath beds, as palaces crunched with rushes scented faintly of mint. And that, for them, was enough. So we've washed our way through tubs of rosewater that weren't really baths, chewed parsley leaves to hide blackened smiles, and we've politely ignored the gong farmers who were shoveling civilization's secrets out of cesspits at night. But to understand the Tudors, you really have to lean into how deeply smell and hygiene, or lack of it, walked straight into their social rituals. Because etiquette in the 16th century wasn't just about using the right fork, it was about managing your personal odor, and pretending that everyone else was also playing along. The Tudor court was a performance. Every hall glittered with cloth of gold, velvet sleeves, polished armor, tapestries stitched over months. But behind the shimmer, there was anxiety. Will I seem too sweaty? Will I smell like stale ale? Will Her Majesty notice that my linen is not freshly boiled? In portraits, nobody sweats. In real life, everyone knew odor was in the room. Manners became a way of disguising it. Bowing low was as much about moving forward quickly before anyone inhaled too deeply. Talking close to the Queen required perfumed gloves. Holding out your hand required a cloth wiped over it with vinegar. Your status was broadcast not just in what you wore, but in how convincingly you concealed your inevitable stink. At feasts, perfumes were scattered across tables. Dishes heavily spiced not just because Tudors liked bold food, but because spice overwhelmed everything else. Sugar, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg. A statement, we can afford these, and also, they'll distract you from the man next to you who hasn't bathed since February. Court banquets weren't quiet meals, they were competitions in perfume and spice. Smells as armor. Smells as propaganda. And there is something boringly inevitable about it. Henry VIII waddled into a hall, ulcers leaking under velvet hose, while courtiers inhaled orange peel and assured him he looked splendid. Elizabeth floated through with her starched ruffs and perfumed gloves. The scent of rose followed her, but so did the gritty shadow of sugar breath, politely ignored. The etiquette at court was to never mention the truth. To bow, flatter, and say the monarch was radiant, even if radiant meant lavender soaked over vinegar scrubbed onto skin that hadn't seen water in weeks. Court life was theater, and the bathroom reality was the backstage set everyone wished would stay hidden. But etiquette also reached further down. Among everyday people, politeness was still tied to smell. If you were invited to someone's home, you expected rosemary scattered on the floor. Not because it helped, but because it was proof the host had tried. Clean linens on the bed meant care. Herbs tucked around walls meant they respected your nose. The absence of them meant you were in the wrong house. Even something as simple as wiping your hands before a shared loaf was ritualized. A servant poured water into a basin, you dipped and dried. It wasn't about germs, they had no concept of bacteria. It was about optics, about seeing someone act clean enough to be trusted. Politics even crept into this. Access to the monarch was access to power. And access meant enduring whatever the chamber smelled like that day. The groom of the stool was powerful not despite his duty, but because intimacy with the king outweighed dignity. Court gossip probably floated not just on rumors of policy but also on whispered complaints about how foul the privies were at Hampton Court this week. Foreign ambassadors visiting London dreaded not just Henry's temper or Elizabeth's wit, but the very air of the audience chamber. They wrote letters back home, hinting politely at the overwhelming sense that clung to their clothes. Imagine a diplomat trying to negotiate trade while privately praying their hosts didn't notice them pinching the inside of their nose. What's strange is that all of this stink didn't lower the Tudors in their own estimation. Quite the opposite. For them, enduring it meant strength. Perfume meant wealth. The ability to keep changing into linen meant status. If your breath reeked of imported spice, it was proof of your reach across the seas. If your teeth were darkened by sugar, that was a golden flex. Stench was never democratic. It was stratified, turned into signal. And as long as you layered your filth with enough cinnamon or peppermint, you were considered presentable. Think again of Elizabeth, giving a speech at Tilbury, starched in white, her gloves soaked in orange oil swinging from her hand. The soldiers cheered, not seeing the missing teeth beneath her smile, not caring that her skin fumes carried more vinegar than roses. They saw majesty, because majesty was repetition. They believed the aura. Etiquette itself created reality, overwhelming whatever smells drifted from beneath the ruffs. So the gross truth of Tudor bathrooms becomes even more ironic. These habits were not hidden mistakes. They were parts of the system. Odor dictated hierarchy. Bathing habits shaped etiquette. Perfumes became politics. Even terrible teeth became fashion. The whole structure of Tudor society rested on performances of cleanliness that didn't actually exist. And everyone agreed to suspend disbelief. The Tudors were masters of pretending. They pretended their river was fresh while dumping chamber pots into it. They pretended rose petals floating in a wooden tub fixed hygiene. They pretended sugar-blackened teeth were signs of status. They pretended vinegar cured plague. And maybe because they pretended so hard, they believed it themselves. And that's where the sleepy comfort lies. Behind velvet doors, kings and queens sweated and stank like everyone else. They wrapped it in etiquette and handed it to you as majesty. They ruled through illusion, not just political illusion, but olfactory illusion. Behind the illusion was linen, vinegar, rosemary, and reality. And if you really wanted power, you held the chamber pot. So here we are, drifting toward the last lap of this stinking Tudor journey. We've tiptoed around chamber pots under beds, walked down muddy streets where vinegar was the cure for everything, and sat uneasily beside monarchs who perfumed their gloves rather than their skin. And really, when you zoom out, the strangest thing is how little of this survived their reputation. Because centuries later, when we say, the Tudors, we still imagine opulence. We think gold, lace, feasts, ruffs. We don't think mass halitosis in the banquet hall or surge pricing for gong farmers at Christmas. The dirt all got wiped from the collective portrait. And that, in its own way, is as fascinating as any war. The Tudors knew what image meant. They leaned on illusion the way modern people lean on deodorant. Portrait painters smoothed away black teeth, powdered wigs, sweat-stained collars. Holbein made Henry VIII's legs look sturdy while in reality ulcers forced him to shuffle. Artists painted Elizabeth like a timeless goddess while she was hollowed with age, skin painted chalky, teeth crumbling. No painter ever leaned down from the canvas to whisper, "By the way, the privies at Greenwich are backing up again." Because who wants to commission art to say, "Here lies the Queen, bathed monthly, perfumed daily, and itchy under her wig"? So the centuries remembered the power and not the smell. We took their propaganda at face value. History textbooks admire their political skill, their marriages, their dramas. But the embroidered truth is that Henry ruled a court where grooms of the stool carried gossip with their towels, where Elizabeth's toothache may have shaped her temper on hard days, where bad breath and vinegar-soaked gloves were as much part of diplomacy as letters and treaties. And you realize, slowly, that history itself participates in the masking. Just as they layered perfumes over unwashed bodies, we layer myths over uncomfortable details. We prefer Henry robust, not pus-dripping. We prefer Elizabeth radiant, not chewing parsley against decay. We prefer a glamorous dynasty, not one living ankle-deep in waste. The Tudor bathroom truth got edited out of the story the way old rushes on palace floors were swept aside for new ones, casually, ritually, as if it had never been there. But maybe this is the most human thing of all. Nobody really wants to be remembered for their smell. We don't write songs about laundry, or build statues of chamber pots. We pick heroism, victories, witty quotes. The grooms of the stool vanish, though they whispered in the king's ear. The laundresses vanish, though they scrubbed the cloth that made nobility feel clean. The gong farmers vanish, though without them the city would have drowned in itself. All erased, all invisible. History, like perfume, remembers only the facade. And yet the grossness is what ties us to them most. Because when you strip away the Elizabethan drama, the shifting of churches, the endless marriages of Henry, what's left? A dynasty of human beings grappling with the same unavoidable truths of biology. Itchy scalps. Rotten teeth. Stomach aches. The urgent, boring need for a chamber pot. Global politics balanced between the smell of cloves and the gurgle of a cesspit. Power clothed in linen desperately pretending to be soap. So when you drift into sleep tonight, think of the Tudors not as remote marble figures but as strangely relatable. Henry VIII, yes, he reshaped a kingdom, but he also sat down on a lined box every evening just like anyone else. Elizabeth commanded an age, but she also stood with perfumed gloves, hoping no one noticed her aching jaw. The most powerful dynasty in England was just another family trying to cover its stench with spice. And maybe, quietly, that's oddly comforting. We live cleaner now. We bathe more often. We have drains and showers and toothpaste. But the underlying loop is the same. We package ourselves. We present an image. We edit out the unpleasant details for the public eye. The Tudors did it with rosemary, we do it with filters. They feared bad smells. We fear bad lighting. In the end, it's the same insecurity, dressed in different fabrics. So yes, the gross truth about Tudor bathrooms is that they were everywhere, unavoidable, and central to daily life. And the comforting truth is that even the most powerful queen in the world still had to deal with lice, chamber pots, and too much sugar. History airbrushed it all away. Tonight, we quietly put it back in. Not dramatic, not scandalous. Just gross. Gross in the calm, boring, ordinary way that stitches you back to them across time. So close your eyes now. Let the palaces fade. Let the stinking streets soften in the distance. Tudor bathrooms are behind you, lavender-scented rushes and vinegar cloths dissolving into a kind of sleepy haze. You don't need to hold your nose anymore. You have plumbing, clean sheets, real soap. You're already living like royalty never dreamed. And the Tudors, powdered and perfumed, can finally rest quietly in portraits that no longer smell. And so we've wandered together through the long, slow corridors of the Tudor world. From Henry's padded close stool to Elizabeth's perfumed gloves, from rushes crunching on palace floors to gong farmers ankle-deep at midnight, we've seen how ordinary and gross bathroom life really was. More chamber pots than chivalry, more vinegar cloths than soap, more illusion than reality. But now, all that really fades. The smells, the herbs, the noise of bustling kitchens and dripping privies. They soften. They flatten into nothing more than history. If the portraits were silent paintings, think of this as the sound gently going quiet again, the way a fire burns down to embers. Just picture it, Elizabeth sitting stiffly under starched lace, Henry groaning in velvet too heavy for his legs, courtiers politely chewing parsley and praying no one noticed the smell, and then slowly, slowly, time pulls it all away. The palaces fall quiet. The people vanish. The rushes rot and are swept aside. All those chamber pots are emptied for the last time. What's left is only stillness. Their world dissolves into ours, centuries later, into clean sheets, calm rooms, running water. A quiet reminder that you, right now, are already more comfortable than any king or queen of the 16th century could dream. So, as you close your eyes, just let that thought hum low in the back of your mind. You are fed, you are warm, you are clean. The Tudors, majestic, noisy, filthy, are only echoes. Their perfumes have faded. The streets have emptied. The portraits stare silently, without smell, without sound. Drift now, into your own stillness. Let history close its door. Let the Tudors fade into painted silence. And you can fall asleep. And even though we've already closed the door on the Tudors, we can let a few last echoes linger, because history, like smell, has a way of clinging longer than you think. The streets of London, with gutters running thick, are gone. But in the imagination, they hum faintly still. The clank of a chamber pot, the whisper of herbs scattered underfoot, the slow trickle of waste down a chute in some castle wall. It's all background now. Quiet. Distant. Think of the laundress again, arms in steam, scrubbing linen until her hands cracked. She doesn't even look up. She just works. Think of the groom of the stool, standing silently, waiting, pretending his job is as normal as any other. Think of courtiers dabbing mint water on their hands, polishing their teeth with cloth, brushing at wigs already itchy. Layer by layer these routines pile, and then layer by layer, they fade. Time erases the stink. Time erases the clatter. Time leaves only the shadow of majesty in portraits, the illusion of perfection, while the herbs, the vinegar bowls, the chamber pots, and their keepers are long dissolved. So what remains tonight is nothing pressing, nothing urgent. Just the steady rhythm of lives that were already monotonous before they faded. Work, eat, wash, sleep, just like yours. Only less comfortable. Only heavier, smellier, slower. And that monotony is oddly calming when you think about it. The Tudors lived inside a rhythm. And you live inside yours. Both repeating. Both persistent. Both ending each day in the same quiet drift toward rest. So now, drift with them. Let the chamber pots be carried far away. Let the rushes underfoot finally burn to ash. Let the perfumed gloves be folded, set down on some long-vanished windowsill. And let the Tudors, with all their gilded discomforts, finally step aside. All that's left is your bed, your clean pillow, your quiet room. Far from London. Far from Henry and Elizabeth, from peasants and laundresses, from rivers and rushes. You're here, now, breathing slowly, eyes heavy. The past has faded. The smell is gone. The silence is yours. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're not marching into battles or sitting stiffly in royal portraits. No, tonight we're doing something much more mundane. We're checking in to a medieval inn. Think of it like Airbnb, but with more fleas and less customer service. This was the everyday reality for travelers in the Middle Ages, from merchants on the road to pilgrims marching toward relics, to the occasional wandering noble who couldn't quite make it back to his manor before dark. When we picture medieval inn, maybe you think of a warm wooden hall with a cheerful innkeeper, mugs of ale, soft candlelight. And sure, there was ale, and there was candlelight. But comfort? Privacy? Decent bedding? Those were optional. The real experience was crowded, smelly, communal, and sometimes you woke up unsure whether that bump under your blanket was a rat or just the inn cat taking liberties. So let's wander in together. Slowly. One squeaky wooden door at a time. The inn sat by the road, usually near a market town or a crossroads. Its sign swung awkwardly in the wind. Signs often showed animals, saints, or simple symbols because, let's be honest, literacy wasn't the strong point of most customers. You stopped, tied up your horse, or if you couldn't afford a horse, you walked straight in carrying road dust on your boots. You pushed through the door. The inn's main hall stretched out before you. Low beams. Smoky fires. A smell that was equal parts stew, spilled ale, damp wool, and humanity. And immediately, you had to hope, was there room? Because medieval inns got crowded fast. Beds weren't guaranteed. Sometimes you paid just for space on the floor near the fire. Sometimes you shared a blanket with a stranger. And sometimes, you got lucky, and snagged a bed with straw refilled this decade. The common room was the center of everything. Long benches. Rough tables. A fire pit smoking enough to cloud the rafters. An innkeeper bustling, his wife stirring pots, maybe a servant boy darting between travelers with mugs of ale. The chatter filled the room. Pilgrims swapping prayers. Merchants laying out goods. Peddlers bragging about journeys. sometimes soldiers or knights, dragging armor clumsily. And in the corner, always the guy singing badly after one too many cups. Food was simple. Bread, ale, maybe pottage, a thick stew of grains, beans, and occasionally vegetables. If you were lucky, a bit of meat. Not a delicate roast. More likely bacon swimming in the pot, or bits of old mutton. Flavoring came from onions, cabbage, sometimes garlic. People tore bread with their hands. Knives were personal. Forks didn't really exist yet. If you didn't bring your own spoon, you used a communal one, or shared the pot altogether. So, yes, double dipping on a large historical scale. Bon appetit. Ale wasn't just a drink, it was necessary. Water was suspect. Rivers and wells collected too much filth. So beer, lightly fermented, was the safe option. Children drank small beer, weak stuff. Adults drank stronger ale. By the time the night wore on, the whole room usually leaned toward drunkenness. Which, of course, made sleeping in a group activity even more entertaining. So after eating, you'd stagger toward the beds upstairs. Picture a cramped wooden staircase. Picture beams so low you cracked your head if you forgot to duck. Upstairs were the sleeping chambers. A single room, most of the time, filled with a row of beds. Privacy wasn't part of the design. No curtains. No locks. Just a row of straw-filled mattresses, sometimes 2 or 3 to a bed, depending how generous the innkeeper felt. If business was booming, floors were sold as beds too. The fee changed. But it wasn't much, since sleep wasn't luxurious either way. The beds were rough. Straw mattresses that crackled underneath you, stuffed many months ago, shaped permanently by other travelers' weight. Fleas and lice happily waited in every seam. You flattened yourself, pulled a thin woolen blanket over your body, and hoped the guy snoring beside you didn't roll into your space. This was medieval traveling luxury, the human sardine bed. Now, of course, inns weren't the only option. For the very poor, sleeping in barns was common. Hay provided free bedding. Roof beams kept off the worst of the rain. And the animals offered warmth, and certain aromas. A bed between 2 cows wasn't exactly glamorous, but it was warmer than a damp roadside ditch. But for those spending coin, the inn was the step up. Though, to be fair, not much of a step. Let's drift back inside the room. Travelers whispering in the night. One man coughing loudly with a persistent illness, no one daring to complain. Another muttering prayers. Kids whimpering themselves to sleep. Boots scattered in corners. The smell of smoke still drifting upstairs, without chimneys to properly vent it. Every movement louder in the creak of wood. And just when you thought silence might settle, the snores began. Thick, loud, overlapping. A chorus of medieval comfort. Earplugs, sadly, not yet invented. Bathing wasn't included. Inns didn't usually provide baths. At best, you found a bucket to wash your hands and face. Sometimes a wooden tub could be filled on request, but hauling water was hard, so few inns bothered. You scrubbed what you could with cloths and fell into bed still dusty from the road. Imagine 30 people compacted in one room, all having skipped a proper bath for weeks. Romance was not in the air. Something was in the air, but not romance. In the mornings, you got up stiff. Someone else's elbow had probably jabbed you in the night. Your blanket had slipped. Your straw had settled in lumps. Someone had gotten up to relieve himself out the window. And someone else had been too drunk to bother, which added a special note to the room. Breakfast was bread and ale. Maybe leftover stew reheated. And then you were back onto the muddy road, leaving behind straw, fleas, and the familiar sound of someone yelling at the innkeeper about the bill. That was the nightly rhythm. And yet, in spite of the crowding, the smell, the fleas, the snoring, the awkward sleeping arrangements, people returned to inns again and again. Why? Because they were safer than lonely roads. Safer than sleeping under hedges. Bandits, wolves, wild weather, all were worse than a drunk neighbor in a straw bed. The inn was noisy, cramped, unsanitary, but it was shelter. It was human company. It was warmth. In its own monotonous way, it was comfort. So if you ever catch yourself sighing about a lumpy hotel pillow or noisy neighbors through thin walls, just remember, you could be in a medieval inn. You could be lying in straw next to three strangers, one singing in his sleep, one snoring like a dying bagpipe, and one suspiciously rolling closer than you'd prefer. And you'd still be glad, because the alternative was frost, wolves, or worse. So, we've stepped into the smoky hall, had our bowl of questionable stew, and finally nested down in that straw-stuffed bed that crunched when you moved. Now the next question is, who exactly were you sleeping beside? Because inns weren't selective. It wasn't a curated guest list. You paid coin, you got space. Which means the common medieval inn was like a giant social blender stirring everyone together, whether you liked it or not. Pilgrims were everywhere. The Middle Ages ran on pilgrimage traffic. Relics called to them, saints' bones, miraculous wells, shrines guarded by monks who kindly looked the other way at the money piling in. Pilgrims walked with staffs, wore the symbols of their journey, and carried stories. And evenings at inns, they turned into storytellers. Not always good ones, but always long ones. You couldn't shut a pilgrim up once he started recounting every village between Canterbury and Compostela. They took inns like hostels, cheap and communal, and considered them part of their holy route. It didn't matter if the bedding smelled like a dead goat. It was humbling. It was part of the pilgrimage package. Then you had the merchants. They were the ones likely arguing over table space, spreading out bits of cloth or trinkets to brag about, always half trying to sell while drinking. Merchants carried money, which made them both admired and distrusted. Everyone assumed merchants cheated on their weights, and honestly, most of them probably did. They filled inns with their cargo talk. If your bedfellow was a merchant, you'd hear all about grain prices in Bruges or which port was refusing English wool this year. And then you'd hear him snore. Loudly. Soldiers also padlocked themselves into inns when they found them. And when I say padlocked, I mean emotionally. Boots kicked off. Armor stacked sloppily in the corner. Ale drowned as if it were medicine. Soldiers were usually the drunk ones passed out on benches, sometimes before they even found a bed. They were rowdy, scarred, and loud, but at least you knew if a fight broke out with strangers, they'd swing their swords before you even staggered up. Protection came built into their presence. Noise too, but that was part of the deal. Sometimes you got nobles, and that could be either a blessing or a nightmare. A minor noble on the road meant coin flowing to the innkeeper and maybe better stew that night. It also meant everyone else was quietly aware that any misstep could get them whipped or fined, so the room turned colder. Nobles traveling with retinues tried to buy private rooms in better inns, but if there weren't enough chambers, they spread right into the same hall as everyone else, sulking in the corner with their attendants forming a protective semicircle. Think celebrity cameo, but one you're advised not to look at too long. Of course, peasants too used inns when desperation pushed them. But most peasants couldn't spare the coin. They slept in barns on journeys, or under hedges when the weather allowed. So when peasants did scrape the pennies for an inn, they were the quietest, trying not to draw much attention, happy to get even a corner of floor by the fire if it meant no frostbite. But the category no innkeeper could avoid, the drunks. Ale was cheap. Beer was safer than water. Which meant many an inn ended with at least one red-faced farmer bellowing songs half-forgotten, collapsing sideways in bed, or worse, missing the chamber pot at night. The medieval inn floor bore witness to many misfires. It was, let's say, more rustic than romantic. And what about women? Inns weren't automatically respectable. Alehouse wives developed reputations, some fair, most exaggerated. Female travelers stuck to pilgrim groups or traveled with family when possible. Lone women in inns attracted stares, suspicion, sometimes worse. But plenty still passed through, peddlers, spinners, washerwomen moving with markets, even midwives on call. They bedded down where they could, often clustering together for safety. Privacy was rare, but solidarity existed in whispers and watchful eyes. So the inn became a melting pot in the most literal sense, pilgrims praising saints beside gamblers cursing dice, merchants scribbling accounts while soldiers scratched rashes, children crying while minstrels plucked lutes. It was chaos in condensed form. And when you finally lay down, the inn turned strangely intimate. You didn't know the names of the people pressed against your side, but you knew their sounds, their snores, their coughs, their twitches. A night in a medieval inn meant bonding through noise. Whether you wanted to or not. And all of this was just normal. Nobody blinked at the lack of curtains or keys. Robberies happened. Fights broke out. But it was safer inside than out. An inn was community, noisy and itchy, but protective. The walls kept the wolves away. The crowd kept loneliness away. The ale kept some diseases away, even if it spread plenty of others. It wasn't luxury. It wasn't comfort. But it was survival. So as you blink in that straw bed, trying to relax while a pilgrim wheezes beside you and a merchant mutters prices in his dream, remember that this was the medieval version of hospitality. Welcome to the inn. Shared space, shared smell, shared life. So, you've found your bed, you've muttered at the soldier who keeps kicking in his sleep, and now maybe you're wondering, what exactly did you eat at this place? Because yes, there was food. Kind of. And drink, definitely. But dining at a medieval inn was less about pleasure and more about preventing starvation. The inn kitchen was not a polished operation. Fire burned in a large hearth. Pots boiled endlessly. Smoke made the rafters black and the air heavy. And what you got in your bowl depended entirely on how much you could pay, and how generous the innkeeper's wife felt that night. Most inns served what was called pottage. Imagine porridge, now add anything lying around. Grains, beans, or peas. Shreds of cabbage. Maybe a carrot if one wandered in. And when someone really splurged, drum roll, bits of bacon or an old piece of mutton boiled to exhaustion. The pot never emptied entirely. One day's leftovers rolled into the next day's base. Yesterday's stew gave flavor to today's. This endless cycle meant tavern pottage always tasted the same, vaguely earthy, salty, and slightly questionable. Bread accompanied everything. Long loaves, coarse brown, made with flour half filled with whatever grew nearby, rye, barley, oats. The good white bread? That was for the aristocrats. In inns, you chewed on heavy, dark bread that sat like a brick in your stomach. Sometimes oats stretched it. Sometimes peas. Sometimes, if the harvest had been bad, strange things like acorn flour sneaked in. You dipped hunks of it into your pottage, softened it, and told yourself it was fine. The innkeeper smiled, knowing you had no choice. Ale was the true staple. Safer than water, brewed by nearly every inn. Strong ale for those who could hold it, and weak, small beer for everyone else, including children. No one questioned that your 7-year-old sipped beer with breakfast. It was just survival logic. Water came from the same rivers that doubled as sewers. You drank what didn't kill you, and what didn't kill you, most often, was ale. Brewed cloudy, yeasty, warm. Served in wooden mugs that probably hadn't been washed since the previous week, just wiped out with a rag that never really dried. By the end of an evening, enough rounds of ale guaranteed noise, songs, and the certainty that someone would fall asleep before reaching the stairs. Food variety increased if you were richer. Nobles might request eggs, cheese, meat pies. But meat pies weren't delicate puff pastry. They were dense, greasy, with fillings like rabbit, pigeon, or whatever animal had recently lost an argument behind the inn. Fish could turn up, dried or salted, but rarely fresh unless you were right beside a river. Spices were a treat, pepper sprinkled lightly over meat, mustard as a sauce, garlic lingering heavy on breath. The ordinary traveler dined simpler: fill the stomach, warm the bones, ignore the lack of subtlety. And cleanliness, well, don't expect much. A single pot fed dozens. Spoons were rare, you carried your own eating knife, scooped with bread, or used your fingers. Communal bowls were shared. And germs, which no one could name yet, passed freely between guests. Don't worry, they thought. The ale will kill it. Which it didn't. Dysentery was a frequent souvenir of the road. A night in an inn often turned into more bathroom trips than you'd like, assuming the privy wasn't already full when you got there. Yet food was always part of the experience. Travelers expected something hot. Even if it was just barley mash reheated 3 times. Inns that couldn't provide it earned bad reputations on the pilgrim routes. You could tolerate lice, you could tolerate snoring neighbors, but a cold hearth with no pottage? That was the sign of a poor house indeed. Entertainment mingled with meals. Singers plucked lutes, wandering storytellers told epic tales of saints and distant wars, dice rolled on tables until disagreements broke out. You ate with these noises surrounding you, one hand clutching your mug, the other tearing bread. The line between eating and drinking blurred fast. By candlelight, with smoke swirling and voices overlapping, the medieval inn dinner was less like a meal and more like a group event staged in mud and ale. If you were unlucky, you'd taste food that had lingered too long. Bad meat salted too lightly. Ale soured by poor brewing. Bread turning hard, twisted into knots. Food poisoning was just a nightly gamble. No one summoned lawyers. No one demanded refunds. You groaned, you hoped you made it through the next day's road, and you kept going. Because inns weren't about luxury, they were about surviving one more day on the medieval highway. Breakfast the following morning didn't mean pancakes or eggs. It was stale bread, reheated broth, more ale. If you could afford it, meat dried or cheese brought out. If you couldn't, you drank and called it good. The road didn't wait for appetites anyway. You left damp straw beds, swallowed what was there, and went out through the smoky door, stomach heavy but not exactly satisfied. So when you imagine travelers clinking mugs by the fire, remember they weren't foodies. They were just grateful they weren't outside in the cold. The stew might taste the same every night for weeks. The ale might cloud your head when you needed to stay sharp. The bread might gnaw your jaw more than you gnawed it. But together, mixed with noise and warmth, it was still better than any alternative. A medieval inn could ruin your digestion, but it also saved your life. So let's take another look around. You've eaten your stew, washed it down with ale, and dragged yourself across the creaking staircase. Now the inn itself starts to reveal its little charms, or rather, the lack of them. Because spending a night inside a medieval inn wasn't just about eating badly and sleeping worse. It was about the building itself closing in on you, wrapping you in an atmosphere of wood smoke, musty straw, and the distinct perfume of humanity. Furniture was as rough as it came. Tables were just long planks nailed down, benches worn smooth from years of travelers' backsides, usually carved with initials, knife scratches, and the odd burn from drunk customers setting candles down directly on wood. Chairs? Maybe a few. But mostly you planted yourself on a bench, and if you were small, you crouched on the floor. The common room floor usually had layers of rushes or straw spread to soak up spills. Which sounds nice and natural, until you remember that the same rushes soaked up everything else too. Ale sloshed. Stew spilled. Bits of food worked into the floor. Boots dragged in mud, manure, snow. And very often, people who couldn't quite make it to the privy. The floor was a sponge of the inn's entire social life. Swept when things got unbearable, layered fresh when someone remembered, but rarely pristine. Walk across it and you always carried a little something upstairs with you. The air was heavy. Inns never had proper chimneys functioning well enough to clear the smoke completely. Fires burned in the hearth downstairs most of the night, but rafters caught the haze. So you spent hours breathing in wood smoke mixed with sweat, mixed with cooking, mixed with whatever unexpected additions the inn had. Your eyes watered. Your clothing reeked. Which honestly didn't matter that much, because you smelled terrible already. Now for the beds. They weren't really beds. They were wood frames stuffed with straw, sometimes rope supports tightened underneath. That's where the phrase, "sleep tight," supposedly came from. Pull the ropes taut so the mattress didn't sag. But ropes loosened, straw flattened, and your mattress quickly turned into lumpy fodder stuffed into rough linen sacks. Fleas loved it. Lice burrowed into it. Straw wasn't replaced every night, sometimes not every season. You nestled down, wrapped in a wool blanket if you were lucky, and added your body heat to the harvest of tiny biting companions waiting there. If you were unlucky, your blanket had more than holes, it had generations of company. And privacy? Forget it. Curtains didn't exist around simple beds unless you were in one of the richer chambers. For most guests, it was just a row of bunks shoved together. Travelers slept 2 or 3 to a bed. Families curled up together. Strangers wedged in shoulder to shoulder, breathing against the back of others' necks, sometimes unconsciously using your arm as a pillow. And if you really couldn't afford a bed, the floor by the hearth downstairs was sold as cheap accommodation. Warm, smoky, noisy, but at least the fire kept you from freezing. Then there was the question of nighttime bathroom breaks. If you were refined, you carried or asked for a chamber pot. Remember, these weren't cleaned in hot water every morning. They were slopped into middens or streets, rinsed at best, then recycled. If you got up in the middle of the night and found yourself stumbling across the crowded-in room trying not to trip over snoring merchants, you weren't aiming for glamour. Some travelers just ducked to the corner. Some staggered outside to the privy hut if there was one, the classic long drop over a pit, the smell of which carried yards away. Depending on the size and age of the inn, the privy might be a plank seat above a dark hole, or just a shed beside the stable. You carried a candle if you dared. You prayed no one had already filled it past capacity. Basic, functional, and terrible. Other environmental gifts included the inn animals. Cats roamed freely, sometimes tolerated because at least they kept the rats down. Dogs lay under tables gnawing bones. And stables connected directly to inns meant you sometimes fell asleep to the sound of horses stamping or lowing cattle tethered outside. An inn wasn't entirely separate from the farm, livestock blended into it naturally. No one thought a barking dog or a crowing rooster out of place midnight. It just added to the soundtrack. Light came from tallow candles, smoky and dripping onto whatever surface they were pinned into. Rooms flickered in unsteady yellow. Shadows made rafters look like looming shapes above. And because candles dripped, most rooms also smelled faintly of rancid fat, mixed into the feast of scents already lingering. Oil lamps were rarer and expensive, tallow was cheap, common, and messy. Welcome to soft medieval lighting. Romantic in films. Drippy in practice. Noise ruled. Floors creaked with every step. Stairs groaned alarmingly. Doors rattled in the wind. The drinking hall downstairs stayed loud half the night if guests were even moderately rowdy. And upstairs, the symphony of snores rattled the beams. Coughing fits spread like percussion instruments. Someone turned in their bed and creaked the wood frame until you wondered if it might collapse. Silence, if you wanted it, was fantasy. And yet, for all this chaos, things carried a rhythm. You knew what to expect. Smell, smoke, fleas, noise, it all came part and parcel with travel. Nobody booked an inn expecting heaven. They booked it expecting walls. A roof. A hearth. And enough human presence to keep robbers at bay. Everything inside the inn all but shouted how temporary it was. Straw replaced eventually. Food cooked until gone. Candles burned down. No detail was permanent. An inn wasn't meant to be a home. It was a stopover, a pause, a liminal space. You arrived, you endured the mess, and you left, grateful, stiff, and slightly itchier than before. So as you glance around your shared chamber in this imaginary inn tonight, the candle sputters, shadows shift, snores rise again in chorus, and you settle, strangely reassured. Because at least for a few hours, inside these motley walls, you're safe. Protected by noise, dirt, smoke, and human company. So let's linger a little longer inside the walls of this medieval inn. Because as much as the straw mattresses, the smoky rafters, and the questionable stew defined the experience, the real flavor of an inn came from the guests themselves. Human behavior transformed everything. And, predictably, humans were not always on their best behavior. The innkeeper set the tone. Usually a stout man, or sometimes a husband and wife team, they juggled being hosts, cooks, accountants, referees, and occasionally, bouncers. Their job was simple in theory: feed you, give you a bed, keep the peace. In practice, they had to stop strangers from open theft, break up dice games that spiraled into fistfights, and smooth over the angry nobleman who thought sleeping next to a merchant was beneath his dignity. Running an inn was less hospitality, more damage control. Rules existed, though loosely. Don't steal from other guests. Don't stab each other in the common hall. Don't cheat too obviously at dice. Don't harass the staff unless you want it to be thrown out into the mud. But of course, rules were always broken. Inns ran on ale, and ale loosened boundaries. By the third cup, gamblers shouted accusations that turned into brawls. Merchants reached for knives over disputed weights. And soldiers tried to crack skulls just because it was Wednesday. A medieval inn could turn from cozy chatter to chaos in under 5 minutes. And yet, this was expected. The noise of dice clattering on wood, the bark of laughter when someone rolled badly, the crash of a pewter mug knocked over, these were standard in the nightly atmosphere. Everyone gambled. With coins if you were rich. With bread or ale if you weren't. What else were you going to do by candlelight, sitting elbow to elbow? Reading? Please. Most guests couldn't read more than a prayer. Rolling dice gave warmth to the room, though it also guaranteed at least one fight a night. Fights followed patterns. A shove. A loud cursed oath. A chair scraping across the floor. Then a flurry of fists. Swords rarely came out, not just because of rule of law but because most people didn't fancy dying over dice. You got bruised, bloody-nosed, embarrassed. And the innkeeper's staff, or sturdier guests, dragged the fighters outside to cool off in the mud. No one thought it shocking. This was part of the rhythm of inns. You ate, you drank, you gambled, you fought, you slept. Theft was another constant. Inns attracted crowds, and crowds attracted opportunity. Travelers with purses of coins had to keep them close, tucked beneath clothes while they slept. Waking up to find your boot knife missing was common. Pilgrims, ironically, were both victims and thieves. Not every journeyer was pious. Some wore scallop shells and badges only as camouflage for pickpocketing. The irony was rich: holy tales by day, sticky fingers by night. An innkeeper tried to prevent it, but they couldn't watch every bed. Inns also had reputations, and not all were flattering. Some doubled as brothels, quietly or openly. Alehouse wives were whispered about with suspicion, whether deserved or not. A woman lingering too long might be accused of being part of the entertainment trade, whether fair or not. Inns blurred those lines all the time, especially along busy pilgrimage routes. What was framed as hospitality often slipped into business on the side. And through all this, the innkeeper kept count. Beds filled meant coins gained. Drinks poured meant profits. Bad behavior tolerated as long as it didn't tear the place apart. Because throwing out drunk gamblers was one thing. But throwing out paying customers meant losing money. Hospitality and tolerance had a direct exchange rate. That's why many inns kept informal house rules nailed to a post. Not that many travelers read them. But the effect was symbolic. Keep the peace here, or sleep outside. Pilgrims tended to mind the rules. Merchants less so. Soldiers ignored them. Nobles just assumed rules didn't apply. The innkeeper picked battles carefully, knowing when to let shouting cool on its own, and when to bring out the hefty staff leaning behind the bar. It wasn't silent at night, either. Gambling sometimes stretched late. Songs rose with ale. Some guests passed out near the fire long after others had crept to bed. An inn was never fully quiet until dawn. The staircases creaked with late arrivals, sometimes with clumsy stumbles down to the chamber pot. Everyone pretended to ignore it. Everyone knew privacy didn't exist anyway. Religion cut through the misbehavior too. Pilgrims said prayers aloud before meals. Priests traveling demanded respect. Sometimes grace at table made everyone hush, even if mid-fight. Faith and mischief comfortably coexisted under the same smoky roof. Drink, dice, prayer, fight, bed, a medieval evening cycle. So that was the social life of the inn. Disorder under the pretense of order. Gambling enjoyed, theft tolerated, brawls expected, music always drifting. The innkeeper fighting chaos with one hand outstretched for payment. Everyone louder than ideal, smellier than remembered, and somehow satisfied enough to come back the next time. Because the truth was simple, inns gave what no roadside hedge could. Light and warmth. A roof loud with life. A place where humans, for better or worse, huddled together in all their messy energy. Safe? Not entirely. Comfortable? Not even close. But livable. And that's what people needed. So the dice games have quieted. The last pewter mugs have thunked to the floor. The innkeeper has finally muttered a prayer for silence and stomped off to his own corner. Now comes the hard part. Not the eating. Not the fighting. Not even the fleas. The hardest part was trying to actually sleep inside a medieval inn. First came the shuffle upstairs. The stairs groaned under every boot. Travelers herded themselves into chambers that weren't really chambers at all, more like big, drafty barns with beds crammed into the corners. If you imagined single rooms with locks and heavy doors, you'd be disappointed. Privacy was a myth. It was communal lodging, row after row, mattress after mattress. Except mattress just meant sacks filled with straw. Old straw. Straw that hadn't been changed since you didn't want to ask when. Beds sagged in the middle. Ropes holding up the mattress loosened. Sleeping tight just meant tightening those ropes, otherwise you rolled into the dip and stayed there. Once you crawled in, that was when you noticed the true standard amenities of the inn, fleas and lice. They lived in the straw. They lived in the wool blankets. They nipped ankles, crawled over necks, chewed happily, and then hitched rides with you when you left. Nobody bragged about it, but everyone knew it. There was probably more crawling life in a bed than there was straw stuffing. But when you were tired after walking all day in mud, you no longer cared. You collapsed. You tried to pretend the itch was just in your imagination. And who shared your bed? Strangers. Travelers curled in twos and threes. A bulky merchant shoving you over with his elbow. A coughing soldier hacking something contagious all over your blanket. A pilgrim mumbling prayers under his breath half the night. Maybe even a child tucked awkwardly between adults, shifting and whimpering. You weren't alone. Not at all. Beds packed people like crates. And if you couldn't afford even that, you nested on the floor near 30 other bodies all wheezing and shifting on their mats. The night was never silent. Noise was constant. Snores of every type, steady hums, occasional growls, high whistles. Sleep talkers muttering promises or confessions. Coughing fits that spread from bed to bed like rhythmic percussion. Teeth grinding. Someone kicking. Someone rolling right into your leg. Sleep became a strange half-state. You didn't sink deeply. You drifted, floating in and out, always snagged back awake by the next sound. And then there was the smell. Heat from human bodies rose under the beams. The air thickened. You inhaled ale sweat, onion breath, freshly unwashed socks, the ghost of stew still clinging to mustaches. The fire downstairs kept smoke rising up, so your room filled with a haze. You breathed ash, sweat, wool, and exhaustion. It was the atmosphere designed not for rest, but survival. The only mercy was that your nose adjusted by dawn. Chamber pots stood somewhere in the corners, but not in enough quantity. Remember, dozens of bodies, 1 or 2 pots. Which meant midnight encounters. Someone stumbling, candle in hand, accidentally dazzling every eyeball in the room as they went to relieve themselves loudly into the pot. If you were lucky, they made it. If unlucky, they stumbled, or the pot toppled, or they didn't quite reach it in time. And once something splashed onto the rushes, well, it was just baked into the floor for tomorrow. Cold crept in too. Inns had plenty of bodies, but thin walls did little against winter winds. You pulled your cloak around you, tucked it under your chin for warmth, and hoped your neighbor radiated some decent body heat instead of stealing the blanket. Every twitch of air sent a draft across your straw pillow. And if there was a hole in the roof? You found out at 3 a.m. when the drizzle found your forehead. Sleep, in short, wasn't deep. It wasn't restful. It was survival. You lay stiff, you shifted, you dozed to the constant music of other people's bodies all doing body things. And in between, you might find flashes of calm, staring at the ceiling beams where candle shadows flickered until the tallow burned down to stubs. By dawn, you hadn't slept well. But you'd slept enough. You dragged yourself back downstairs into the smoky hearth room, eyes gritty, limbs stiff. Breakfast awaited, stale bread, thin broth, weak ale. You chewed, you swallowed, and you accepted that this was, somehow, better than sleeping in a ditch. That was the real night cycle of an inn, exhaustion knocking against noise, fleas winning against skin, smells circling endlessly, and still, the strange comfort of not being alone in the dark. Morning in a medieval inn didn't arrive gently. There were no curtains, no quiet alarms, no soft hotel breakfasts left politely at your door. There was noise. And plenty of it. The first rooster crowed from the stables outside, muffled but still unmistakable, a kind of rustic alarm clock you didn't set. Hooves struck against wooden stalls. Dogs stirred themselves awake and began barking at shadows that didn't need barking at. And if that somehow didn't wake you, the sound of dozens of your fellow travelers all groaning and creaking to their feet would finish the job. You didn't rise refreshed. You rose stiff. A straw mattress wasn't designed for long-term comfort. It sagged under your shoulders, poked at your calves, flattened under your hips. Your skin itched where the fleas had made a banquet of you. Your neighbor had rolled onto half your cloak during the night, leaving you cooler than you expected. And your ears were still ringing from the snores. Getting up from that bed wasn't an elegant stretch into morning sun. It was hauling yourself out of another problem and into the next one. The room was already drafty and noisy. Someone had lit a candle. Someone else had stepped into their boots too loudly. Strangers muttered half-greetings under their breaths while pulling on cloaks. The merchant coughed thickly as he wiped crumbs of sleep from his beard. The soldier hawked spit into the straw by the bed, because manners in the morning didn't matter. A pilgrim already knelt in the corner, mumbling prayers, thanking a saint that he hadn't been robbed while asleep. Meanwhile, your stomach rumbled, not from excitement for breakfast, but from cautious dread at whatever breakfast meant here. The journey downstairs was its own ordeal. Wooden steps creaked and complained under the weight of boots. Someone always tripped over the narrow stairwell, clutching the beam, swearing under their breath. And when you reached the common hall again, you found it looked almost the same as the night before, only dirtier. The fire had burned down to gray ash that still smoked faintly. Tankards and pitchers from last night sat overturned, pooling stale ale onto tables. Bones and pieces of bread crust were left scattered across benches. The rushes on the floor had absorbed one more night of droppings, drippings, and spills. It reeked of smoldering wood, sour beer, and human order slowly reforming itself after chaos. And at the center of it all, the innkeeper. Already awake, already moving, but not exactly bright-eyed. His hair uncombed, face grizzled, apron stiff with yesterday's stew stains. Still, he moved with a practiced rhythm, gathering mugs, smacking awake the servant boy who nodded off on the bench, muttering about guests who hadn't paid yet. He was businessman, janitor, policeman, and priest all in one. The morning wasn't about breakfast yet. It was about restoration. Clearing tables, scraping food into the pigs, setting right what had been used too aggressively the night before. Breakfast eventually emerged, though to call it breakfast might be too generous. It wasn't a spread. It was what you got yesterday, reheated. The pottage pot, never truly empty, had been dragged forward again. It looked thicker now, darker, like it had absorbed both time and sins. Bowls banged onto the table. You got bread again, a little staler than before. If there was cheese, you counted yourself lucky. If there was bacon, you considered it a blessing. But mostly it was just ale again, mugs filled for the sleepy and the weak, barley broth reheated because hunger left you no choice. You sat on that same bench that still smelled faintly of ale, broke your bread, and chewed slowly, not because it was delicious, but because it was too tough to eat quickly anyway. And all around you, the inn lived again. The soldier grunted as he strapped on his boots, tightening leather that stank of sweat and muddy fields. The pilgrims formed clusters, saying morning prayers together, faces gray with exhaustion but determined to frame their grogginess as devotion. Merchants repacked their goods, rolling up cloth bundles, counting coins, sighing when they realized they'd lost more at last night's dice than they had in sales. Children cried. Dogs snapped at scraps. A cat meowed insistently, hoping someone slipped it a strip of bacon, though the odds of bacon existing in this room were slim. Then came the matter of payment. Inns weren't charities. You may have shared beds, eaten reheated stew, sipped from mugs that had never truly been washed, but all of it still had a price. The innkeeper made his rounds, apron still dusted with crumbs, palm open, muttering the fee. Sometimes guests groaned at the total. Sometimes they argued. Pilgrims pleaded poverty. Merchants accused the innkeeper of cheating on the ale count. Soldiers tried to remember if they had anything smaller than a coin larger than the meal itself. But at the end of it all, you paid. Because not paying meant being thrown out now and barred later. Inns talked. And a traveler branded as untrustworthy would find doors suddenly closed in every market town. Coins clinked into the innkeeper's hand, and he noted each transaction like an account tallied in his head. Some travelers bartered instead. A strip of cloth for a meal. A chicken for a bed. Inns in rural areas worked with whatever guests carried. The innkeeper didn't love it, but he always accepted it. Payment was payment. A barter clogged the bookkeeping, but a fat hen was as useful as a shining groat. The inn staff worked through the morning chaos with barely a thought. Clearing tankards. Sweeping rushes back into piles and layering fresh ones down. Emptying chamber pots into the midden behind the inn, gagging as they went. Feeding the animals at the stable. Forkfuls of hay shoved into stalls, buckets swinging with water that already looked brown. Travel meant animals too, horses, donkeys, mules. They had to be ready for the road and never cared about your headaches. They kicked, they brayed, they snorted steam into the air while you struggled to rub sleep from your eyes. Once the bills were settled and breakfast swallowed, the real moment of an inn's morning began, departure. That was when everyone spilled out the door together, a herd of groggy humanity wrapped in cloaks against the wind. The road didn't wait until you were ready. Pilgrims set out first, staffs tapping against mud. Merchants trailed behind, weighed down by sacks and packs, muttering curses at muddy boots before the first mile even passed. Soldiers adjusted weapons and slung packs, already sniffing for the next inn with fresher ale. The departure was messy. Someone always forgot a boot by the fire the night before. Someone misplaced a coin purse, leading to accusations of theft last minute. A merchant hollered about a missing belt, eventually found tied around a donkey. Children wailed, because children always wailed. And through it all, the innkeeper shouted hearty goodbyes with one hand while pocketing the last coins with the other. Everyone wanted to leave, nobody wanted to linger, because the longer you lingered, the more stale ale you smelled and the more chores you got roped into. And then, slowly, quiet. The door swung idly in the wind again. The benches were empty. Rushes crunched softly underfoot without bodies pressing them down. The inn survived another night. It would refill again that evening. Another crowd of pilgrims and peddlers, soldiers and drunks. The cycle continued every day. Smoke, stew, dice, fleas, snores, payment, departure. No one was ever truly clean. No one was ever truly empty for long. Life in transit pulsed through it constantly. But let's stay for a moment in that liminal calm. Imagine you've left your coin. You've chewed your stale bread. You've tightened your boots and dragged your stiff body up to the threshold. You look back once, at the rafters heavy with smoke stains, at the straw still clinging to benches, at the innkeeper already shouting instructions to his wife. You sigh, not in relief, not in regret, just in the dull acceptance of travel. This is what everyone endures. You've slept, badly. You've eaten, indifferently. And now, you move on. That's how inns worked. Not places to remember fondly, but places that kept you alive. The road outside offered no softness. Mud pulled at boots after rain. Dust clung after drought. The landscape was wide and empty, hedgerows marking fields, church towers faint in the horizon. Other travelers trudged ahead of you. And in your head, already, you thought of tonight. Tonight would bring the same thing. Another inn. Another hall filled with noise and stew and dice. Another smoky bed, another elbow in your ribs, another payment to the innkeeper. Travel wasn't about new experiences, it was about repetition. Each town, each inn felt the same when you were bone tired. But sameness meant understanding. Sameness meant survival. For the innkeeper, the cycle was profit. For the traveler, it was endurance. For both, it was rhythm. A bad inn could ruin your day. A good one could save your life. Most fell somewhere in between, bearable, barely clean, but functional. A medieval inn wasn't supposed to delight you. It was supposed to keep you from freezing in the ditch. And it did. In the slow, stubborn, oddly comforting monotony of wood beams, straw floors, and stew that never really ended. Even now, if you close your eyes, you can hear it. The morning shuffle. The coughs. The complaints about coin. The creak of leather boots tightening. The bray of a donkey outside, impatient. And through it all, the voice of the innkeeper calling out farewells, already thinking about the next feast of stew he'd throw into the pot. Already knowing his benches would be full again by dusk. That was the rhythm of departure. That was morning in a medieval inn. Not satisfying. Not peaceful. But dependable in its own messy way.